All right, thanks everybody for attending. I was anticipating at least 5 people would still be standing, and I've more than doubled the quota, so I appreciate everyone sticking around. So my name is Matthew McCourt. I'm a senior practice leader with Mandiant Consulting. I work with a team that does incident response remediation when clients are going through a bad situation. Then we also take what we learn from the realities of what actually works to eradicate threat actors, and we help clients proactively assess their security architectures for on-prem, cloud, anything in between. So what we are going to focus on today is the realities of what we see on the front lines of doing incident response for clients that have gone through an impactful event related to ransomware. So we are really going to focus on the realities of what happens when financially motivated threat actors gain access to an organization, perform reconnaissance, steal data, and then cause an impact. So we will walk through what are some of the new modern techniques that we're seeing, but most importantly, right, what are the prioritized security controls that organizations must adopt and really should align to ensure that they are protecting their environment. Some of these controls and processes we will talk about will be technical in nature. Some will be more programmatic in nature. But what I really want everyone to focus on is just the art of the possible, practical, and scalable. I was very purposeful in ensuring that all the recommendations I have in here are realistic things that we've seen organizations accomplish. Think about your security architecture as I'm going through the presentation and how you could maybe bolster up your focus on enhancing the program to really help better defend and protect against an impactful event from happening. So when we think about this from the lens of how do we want to refocus our prioritized reinvestment in our security program, right? It really boils down to what are we looking to do? I think the main goal most organizations would have by focusing on the strategy is to really minimize the probability of a single event, right, cascading into a large-scale incident that has an impact on the organization. And today what we're seeing is threat actors are compromising environments, they're stealing data, they're encrypting systems, they're destroying data, and that really is causing a large-scale impact for organizations. But in order to do this, right, we have to kind of focus in 3 phases of how do we want to tackle this strategy. The first one is we need to identify and understand the threat. So I will walk you through what does the threat look like today. Then we need to identify and align security controls that correlate to what we have in our environment to help protect against that threat, which I will walk you through in a very generalized manner. And then, I think the third very important piece is we have to continually validate, test, identify, how well things have been implemented. And it's okay to identify gaps at that stage, but it really is important to test, measure, and validate. If we can do that, right, we can start to quantify the return on investment strategy for our cybersecurity program. And we can do that by demonstrating the effectiveness of the existing controls that we have in place today, just how well are they working. We can maybe help justify, security controls or additional processes or people that we need based upon the gaps that we've identified. And most importantly, we can help, fast track investments and fast track decision making based upon factual data that we have about our environment and just how well protected and architected it is against the modern day threats. So what are we seeing today, right? What does the threat landscape look like, and how do we, need to focus our controls? This is kind of fast forwarding to the end of the story, right? Unfortunately, when an attacker is able to gain access to an environment and they have privileged access and they're able to compromise identities and deploy ransomware, it's already too late in the game. But this is kind of the end, and then we will work backwards so we can prevent our organization from being in this state. But what we are seeing today versus, many, many years ago, the ransomware deployment is happening very, very fast. Typically, it's a few days from when an organization has that initial compromise to when ransomware is deployed. So attackers are gaining access. They're doing some sort of reconnaissance within the environment. They're actually trying to map out privileged identities. Where does the data live? They're starting to stage data for data theft. So data will eventually leave the environment. And then they start creating that impact of deleting backups. Maybe they're changing passwords for identities and deploying ransomware. Most ransomware deployment that we see today is very, very automated, and it really is the attackers living off the land and using the organization's security tools against them. So they're using group policy, they're using SCCM, they're using Intune. Think about all the tools that you have in your environment today that have the reach, the capability to interface with your endpoints. That is what the attackers are going after to actually deploy ransomware at scale in a very fast manner. And we refer to that infrastructure as trusted service infrastructure. I'll talk about that in a few more slides coming up. Like I said, a few days. Some organizations, I think about a third of the incidents we worked last year, this was less than 48 hours from initial access to when an attacker had reached this stage of the game where they're able to create an impact within an organization. Unfortunately, the aftermath, I think many of these elements that you see here are pretty, you wouldn't be surprised to understand, the infrastructure is no longer operational, right? The business can't function. Oftentimes, the organization is locked out from actually using, their accounts to log in and do things. And the environment is completely broken, right? It's untrusted, and there's a lot of chaos, there's a lot of confusion happening. These are just the realistic impacts that we see. Some of the additional impacts that I think when we think about a return on investment strategy that will require additional investment, additional spend, really from the financial perspective and also from some of the challenges that you see there. Many of these things happen in parallel, right? It's not like a sequential action of one, follows the other, but there's a lot of third-party assistance. There's a lot of surge that's needed to really help recover, regain positive control of that infrastructure. And I think during the keynote today, and a little bit yesterday, you heard about some of the challenges that organizations that have gone through an impactful event, just exactly what did they experience? I think it maps to a lot of these bullets up here. But these are things that organizations may not have planned a budget for or plan to actually focus prioritizing resources and security spend on if they have to go through a security event. So, in order for a threat actor to reach the stage of being able to deploy ransomware and creating that large-scale impact, there's an equation, right? They need three parts of this equation in order to succeed in their mission. They need access, right? They need to open a door to gain some sort of access into the organization. They need to have credentials, right? They need some sort of credentials that have the privilege, the capability to interface with systems and where they can actually steal data and maybe deploy an encryptor. And they need that trusted connectivity that exists within environments. So from an organizational perspective, if an organization can take away any parts of this equation, that's a key win for an organization to maybe stop something that's an initial event, maybe an initial intrusion from cascading into something that results in a large-scale impact for their organization. So let's talk about each part of that equation and focus on how do threat actors gain access into environments today. So kind of put these into three buckets, if you will. The first is related to identity. The second is exposed assets. These are the doors that attackers will pry open to gain initial access. When we think about identities, it's very important that we just don't think about someone like the human side that has a username and password that they're typing in. But identity could be programmatic. It could be keys, tokens. It could be secrets that are stored, right? Think about how the API infrastructure works today with logging in and that sort of thing. So it's more than just a human account, right? It can be more than that. Exposed assets, that could be what's external facing. Maybe it's a system that has a vulnerability. It could be a system that just has default credentials configured. Oftentimes we will see management interfaces for security devices that are inadvertently exposed to the internet. So think about just the exposure from the attack surface of what could an attacker attempt to open from a door perspective to gain access. The trusted service infrastructure, which I'll talk about in a little more detail, that's where they want to go. That's where they want to land. Those are the core assets that run your information technology program that have the capability to, if they are abused, to be leveraged by an adversary to create an impact in a short amount of time. So some of the common initial access factors that we see today, right? Stolen identities, stolen credentials. If single-factor authentication is still permissible in an environment, that is certainly going to be a way that the adversary might be able to get in. This could be on VPN, maybe remote desktop type infrastructure or Citrix or that sort of thing. Like I mentioned, it could be external facing assets that just have vulnerabilities, default credentials, or some sort of capability that the threat actor could interface with. It could be backdoors that have been installed on devices. Maybe a user was phished, or maybe they downloaded software that resulted in a backdoor on their endpoint, which is then used by an adversary. Oftentimes, organizations don't consider home devices that are correlated to users as part of the corporate attack surface. But we've actually seen that change, right? We're seeing information stealers being deployed on corporate devices or even personal devices. So if you allow employees to have like a BYOD or maybe access login portals using their home computers, and they download something nefarious on their home computer, it could be an information stealer on there that is capturing username and password. It could also be capturing post-authenticated cookies, which can then be replayed for access into an environment without having to actually re-authenticate as that user. So that is certainly part of the realistic attack surface. The reselling of compromised identities is starting to outpace phishing as the #1 way for gaining access to an organization today. We still see phishing, which I'll talk about here in a second, but we've also seen more modern techniques of social engineering, SIM swapping, SMS-based messages being spammed to users, and even users contacting help desks, masquerading as legitimate employees to try to get their information, an employee's password reset, or to try to get them to not require MFA because they will claim, I've lost my device and I just need to get in, I need to log in to complete this task really quick. So the social engineering game is certainly ramped up, and it certainly is when you hear about UNC 3944 and Scattered Spider. Those are some of the techniques you see in that last bullet that are representative of what they are doing as initial access today. So when we think about phishing, right? Phishing has come a long way over the past few years. And phishing today is really about stealth, evasion, and persistence. It's no longer just about trying to get somebody to click a link where maybe there would be malware installed in an endpoint. It is now about identity takeover. It's about the adversary trying to blend into the environment, to persist, maybe via the email infrastructure or other ways. And oftentimes we will see attackers register malicious applications. If you think about Microsoft 365, users may have the ability to consent to registering an application within the environment. If an attacker is able to register an application, and based upon the permissions of that user, the attacker may actually be able to correlate a certificate to that application and just log into the application. We could reset the password for the user. We could change their MFA method. It's not going to matter because the attacker might be able to use that malicious application as their way to persist within the environment. Attackers also want to know what's going on, right? So they want to ensure that they have visibility into the communications that are happening today. So that's why they're trying to implant themselves as best they can within the email infrastructure of the environment. And they're also trying to evade, as the organizations have upped their security game as far as phishing protections, they're going to new methods. So they're trying SMS, they're calling people, they're using QR codes. Anything that might be able to evade some of the more modern defenses that organizations have in place, that's where the adversary is moving. What we also see the adversary doing is using a technique called adversary in the middle, which is essentially where an attacker sits in between that authentication transaction. So even if the user is configured for multi-factor authentication, the attacker will sit in the middle of the transaction, let the user authenticate successfully, and then they will snipe or steal the session token after the authentication, steal that token and use it for token replay, where then they can actually log in post-authentication and masquerade as the user. So what can we do to actually protect ourselves based upon the changing landscape that we see today? So I have a few graphs in the slide. This is the first one where we're going to kind of look at different ways that you can implement multi-factor authentication and just the overall value that it provides. So unfortunately, if you have single-factor authentication, you're going to be subject to many of the common techniques that you see there in the blue box on the lower right that represent some of the more modern techniques of what is happening with phishing today and an adversary being able to gain access into the environment. So if we up our game a little bit, maybe we're going to do email-based MFA, or we're going to do SMS or phone call, or maybe even like a challenge response from a question and answer type thing. We might eliminate some of the lower hanging fruit or some of the easier ways that adversaries might be able to get into the environment, but it certainly isn't going to take away from somebody that's a little more sophisticated or a little more motivated for trying to gain access into the environment. In order to take away some of these other techniques from the attacker's toolkit, right, we have to continue to level up. So this is where we see a lot of organizations have moved today, right? They're using the mobile authenticator applications, and they're starting to maybe go away from the push aspect, but maybe it's number matching. Maybe it's geo-verification where the authenticator app will show like where the authentication request is originating from. But there's different ways with the mobile authenticator applications. And as you can see, we've actually taken away a lot of capabilities that the adversary has. The challenge is these methods are still subject to adversary in the middle. I could still probably social engineer somebody into reading the number that they see on the screen if I'm pretending like I'm the help desk calling them, right? So they're not going to be, the be-all, end-all for all of the techniques that we see there. So there's still ways adversaries can circumvent, even if you've moved up to the upper left quadrant there. Where organizations need to go to really become more resilient against the adversary in the middle and some of these account takeover type attacks today, it's a combination of really that strong multi-factor authentication using FIDO2, but it's also going away from the singular transaction of just that user authenticating, but now we're going to bring in the device as part of that transaction. So it's the attributes of the user, attributes of the device, correlated together to create that strong authentication transaction, and that can go a long way towards just defeating most of the techniques that you see there on the screen. Obviously, physical possession of a device or a person to coax them to do something is a whole different threat model. But we've actually taken away many of the capabilities that we see today for that initial access just by moving up to that upper right quadrant of the graph. Realistically today, most organizations are kind of, they're still on the left and they're starting to onboard, their admins and their high profile users into that upper right quadrant. And they're finding that like with passwordless, with Windows Hello, and some of the other modern ways today, the users actually enjoy the experience. Right? But it does come at a cost. So that's why you see it over there on the left. Just because there is a cost for the process side of it, there's the cost for the distribution, the management of the keys, depending on which platform that you're using. So there is an administrative, there's also a cost for how do you maintain this over time. But it is something we do see organizations that are starting to pivot that way to just create a stronger defense for their MFA. So what is also important to understand, right, is the impact of a stolen identity. What sort of impact does that have on your organization? Obviously, I think the items that you see at the top there represent a point-in-time type transaction that might happen, right? If an attacker steals an identity, if multi-factor is not configured, they can probably log in, maybe to your VPN, maybe to a SaaS platform or something in the cloud, or even pivot into your on-prem applications. But those are point-in-time type transactions, right? Granted, the attacker may do it multiple times over a day, week, month, or year, but it's a single occurrence each time. Those that you see on the bottom often are not considered or overlooked as to the impact of a stolen identity and what sort of ramifications that could have for an organization today. So if the adversary is able to compromise an account that is still in that to be registered for MFA status, right, they can actually register their own device and blend in and really complete that identity takeover. Maybe they can join their laptop or their device to the domain to achieve that trusted or compliant status, if that's part of the criteria for authentication. Or maybe they have access to do additional recon, so then they can socially engineer the help desk. So these are all more persistent type activities that can happen for a true identity compromise that can make it very, very difficult for organizations to recover from and really understand the breadth and depth of what happened within their environment. So what we try to recommend organizations do, right, is start to move towards the right of this table here. And really, the lower right is where you are going to get the biggest protection. And really, this allows organizations to think about if they have a potential identity compromise. It's an interesting event, but it doesn't have to result in a full-scale incident with an impact to the organization, right? If we're creating that strong multi-factor requirement, we're also requiring that the device be part of that validation and that transaction, and maybe we're introducing trusted locations or some sort of geo-fence boundary as part of that transaction. We can go a long way. It buys us a lot of time to investigate just how did that identity get compromised in the first place, but we can also know that they weren't able to complete that full transaction today. We also want to make sure that organizations realize that in the hybrid integrated world today, if there is an identity compromise, like the first thing everyone wants to do is let's reset the password, let's disable the account. Well, those are very important steps in today's world, right? Even if you do that, like an intra ID, if you're using Microsoft, the session could still be valid for up to 24 hours even after doing that. So you want to make sure that your playbooks are updated to ensure that you have processes to actually go in and also revoke the refresh tokens. Some things you can do with the identity provider or the IDP. Some things you might even be able to do at the application. You may be able to invalidate the session tokens there, or maybe even invalidate the cookies. You also want to take a look. While that account was deemed to be compromised, did the attacker register any rogue devices? Have we seen any new device registrations or modifications? If so, let's validate with the user that this is expected and anticipated. Did the attacker go and change the MFA methods? Going back to that last graph I had, we had SMS was down at the bottom, and then we had the authenticator apps, and we had the FIDO2 up at the upper right. Just because you're enforcing FIDO2 doesn't mean other methods might be available for the user to choose out of convenience. So you definitely want to make sure that you've aligned, just what the user can actually choose and what they can't, and has anything changed as part of that, because obviously attackers will try to downgrade and make it a little bit easier for them to blend it or do that identity takeover. We also want to look for rogue applications that are registered on behalf of that identity that could create that persistence within the environment. Another area to focus on from a return on investment strategy for your processes is just how are you verifying your staff when they call into the help desk. Help desk wants to help people, right? That is their role in life, is to be helpful and to help solve problems and help solve challenges. But if you're not able to positively verify who that person is that you're speaking to, it could be someone that's trying to social engineer the help desk in order to gain access into the environment. We've really seen this amplify over the past year to 2 years, especially with UNC 3944 and Scattered Spider. Right, so you want to figure out how do you actually verify, is it getting them on camera and also verifying with like a picture ID. We've had some organizations that would require that the manager of that employee be part of that conference call when they were in a dire situation, when there was a full identity takeover and the organization was trying to reestablish positive identity. Sometimes organizations may lock down of where you can actually change your password from, or actually change your MFA criteria. Maybe it can only come from parts of the infrastructure where a user can be vetted from their device perspective. And some organizations have gone into full lockdown mode when they're under attack, where they're just gonna kind of freeze that process to prevent the damage from getting worse. But having modernized playbooks that cover these is a great return on investment strategy for your organization. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about trusted service infrastructure. So this is an area, this is the target of where adversaries wanna go. So if you see those bulleted lists of all those items that we have up there, right? Those are the crown jewels of what's running your information technology platforms and your infrastructure today. It's very important that you really enhance the security controls around who can access that, who has line of sight to actually get to those types of assets and technologies and platforms from an administrative perspective. So we are seeing adversaries now, they're trying to go, they're trying to get domain admin so they can get configure a group policy, push out encryptors that way, but really they're going after the virtualization stack. Right, so these are areas that organizations have already invested a lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of people to help manage these. Unfortunately, if they're abused, if they're accessed by an adversary, it's going to be a negative return on investment because it's going to create a large impact for the organization. So one of the things that we want to focus on, just kind of bringing this all together here, is from the identity perspective. Right, we want to understand the scope of identities that we have from a privilege perspective, from programmatic, from the human. Start to align, do we actually need this many privileged identities, this many identities that map to privileged roles? How can we pull that back? And really, how are we enforcing strong authentication? Like what we have highlighted there in red is that identity and device, creating that multi-context authenticated transaction is where we want the organizations to be focused on. Exposed assets, understanding what you have exposed, doing an inventory of those, really testing and validating, if we think we're enforcing multi-factor authentication everywhere, but we have a few portals that we find, maybe via proactive scanning that don't require MFA, how do we actually pull those back and reduce the overall scope and impact of those being accessed? And our trusted service infrastructure, which I'll talk about in a little more detail here. So virtualization. This, in almost every ransomware case that we work, the virtualization platform is targeted, and attackers are gaining access either directly to the bare metal where the hypervisors are, or to the administrative consoles that manage the VM backends. And they are not only stopping all the VMs, they're deleting the snapshots, they're actually stealing the or they might actually be stealing the VM DKs directly so that they have their own copy of things. And then they are deleting things. They're not only deleting the files, they're also locking the organization out of regaining access back into their ESX or Hyper-V or virtualization platform. If you think about what organizations have virtualized today, right? If you came into work and all of a sudden all of your virtualization platforms were down, all the services that live on top of that were unavailable, and you just need to log in to try to recover from backup, but you can't even log in. This is what actually creates the longest duration from a recovery and reconstitution perspective. So we want to think about how do we have separate identities that manage our virtualization and our trusted service infrastructure stacks. We don't want those to be the same identities that we use for day-to-day, accessing email and other things. We want to create that segmentation from the identity side. We want to, really reduce the line of sight. All these administrative planes and consoles, how do we actually, use network segmentation to our advantage to ensure that they're not accessible from everywhere within the network, but maybe only from, specific, privileged access workstations or certain, points of our environment. And we really want to enforce that we are following best practices for locking down our infrastructure. For VMware, we recommend that each physical host that's running like ESX or ESXi has a randomized password. It's not the same root password because we will see attackers. They'll be able to log into a vault that might have the local root password. They can log into everyone with that same account and then create that impact. Talk a little bit about connectivity. Today we see, obviously attackers, they gain access. They're laterally moving between environments. They're also doing what we refer to as vertical movement. So vertical movement is pivoting from on-prem to the cloud and vice versa. And they are able to do this because organizations have their accounts synced, right? They might have a privileged account on-prem that's a domain admin. They sync it to the cloud and it has a global administrator role, maybe in the Microsoft Azure or Intra world. So we want to ensure we have that identity segmentation to prevent that from happening because a lot of organizations are storing their backups now in the cloud. And we've seen attackers compromise on-prem, go up to the cloud, disable soft delete, and then they wipe out the backups essentially. And it really just prolongs that entire restoration process for clients. So identity segmentation is probably the #1 strategy that we work with clients to implement during a pre-ransomware situation. It's a lot more, I think it's a lot more scalable to think of Active Directory as a security tool these days. You can use Active Directory. You can do user rights assignments to actually start pulling back the scope of how and where accounts can be used within the environment. Organizations find they can do this safer and faster than trying to do network segmentation and trying to put layer 3 blocks around all the places. Sometimes that just isn't a fast strategy. So think about your playbooks for how do you enforce identity segmentation. How do you actually isolate and protect your crown jewels, not only your trusted service infrastructure, but your core assets? And really test and validate, right? Everything may look great on paper, may look great on the network diagram, but until you have a red team or a purple team come in to actually test and verify, that's that third part of that ROI process is really test, validate, identify gaps, and work to resolve those. Talk a little bit about credentials here. So a lot of credentials today, maybe they're stolen, maybe they're part of a previous breach. Common passwords, brute forcing, we still see that. It's a very common tactic that we see today. And as I mentioned, information stealers, backdoors on devices where keyloggers and other things can be present. Once attackers get credentials, they're usually not lucky, and on the first try they don't get full domain admin. So they will use techniques like credential dumping from the endpoint that they have access to. They'll do Kerber roasting, where in Active Directory, if there's a service principal name associated with a service account, the attacker can request a Kerberos ticket and try to crack the password for the service account and then use that to elevate privileges. And sometimes we just find overly permissive roles. Active Directory in most environments has been around for a long, long time. It's a lot of drift that comes with that type of infrastructure. And sometimes there's a lot of roles that just have overly permissive, roles associated with them, really dating back to legacy, and it just did not get cleaned up over time. So one of the things we want to focus on is identity segmentation. So we used to recommend using group policy to create the tiering model of tier 0, 1, and 2 using user rights assignments. Since 2012 R2, there's a feature in Active Directory called authentication policies in silos. We certainly recommend organizations adopt that. That is something that is the art of the possible and practical today, and it really pulls back that centralized configuration of where can a privileged identity log into. You can actually create guardrails and boundaries using authentication policies and silos to say this domain admin account can only log on to this privileged access workstation or these domain controllers and can't be used anywhere else. Really want to focus on just-in-time type access or approval for those privileged type functions, and also phishing-resistant MFA where possible. When a user logs into an endpoint, there's a lot of artifacts that are left behind on disk, in memory, in various places, right? So we obviously want to harden our endpoints to reduce the capability for privileged accounts to be, have their artifacts available for an attacker to come by, snipe and pick up, and then use against the organization. There's the Protected User Security Group, which is an awesome group that's been in Active Directory for the past 12 years, since 2012. A lot of organizations don't realize it's there or the power it has. If you put your privilege, start testing, obviously, put your privileged accounts into that group, it pulls back the ability for all these breadcrumbs and artifacts to be left behind on endpoints for credential theft and privilege escalation. Talk a little bit about backup. Backup and recovery is the long pole in the tent when it comes to ransomware restoration. When you hear organizations indicate it takes them weeks, months, sometimes maybe it's half a year to recover, this is why, right? The backups are deleted by an attacker. They're inaccessible. If you think about all those broken items that we had in the previous, in a slide, a little while ago in the presentation, we can't even log into the backup infrastructure because it has a dependency on Active Directory. Maybe DNS is broken because it's part of Active Directory. We need to understand all of the dependencies we have in order to gain access into our backup infrastructure type of environment, right? Most organizations don't really have an isolated recovery environment that truly is independent from the core production environment. That is an environment that can operate on its own, has no dependencies to corporate production whatsoever, and it is truly air-gapped and isolated and has data one-way synced into it at random times. Most organizations might have an isolated data vault, but a lot of organizations unfortunately just have their backups just directly integrated within the domain, within the on-prem or cloud architecture, where they don't have proper identity segmentation or network segmentation to protect against an adversary if they have the right privilege, if they have the correct line of sight, gaining access to the backup console to create that impact and create damage. So very important to understand where you are on this chart and how can you align some of these practical controls. Even if you are at the bottom, doesn't mean that's a terrible situation, because you can actually do a lot from identity and network segmentation to help protect that type of environment until you can slowly start to move up from a recovery and planning perspective. So definitely want to make sure you have multiple copies of your backups, that they are immutable, that they can't be changed or modified. You also want to ensure that you have your backup recovery keys and certificates stored offline. We have had many instances where the recovery keys and certs to get back into the infrastructure were also encrypted and unavailable. And please do not virtualize all of your domain controllers using the same virtualization platform, because then your identity is, if you look at that dependency mapping, it's kind of backwards. You'll never get back into it. So at least ensure you have a few physical DCs that you can get to and work from in the event that something really, really bad happens. So just to wrap up, I know I have a few minutes. We often get asked, for all these recommendations, where do we start? Like, how do we even know, we've got these, 50 things that we know are gaps, that we know are deficiencies. How do we actually prioritize this to make progress? And I recommend this to all of our clients we work with. Let's identify what are the most highest risk items related to controls not being present or not being enforced properly, and from the factor of time, right? What are the ones we can actually do in a reasonable amount of time that don't require a lot of manpower, testing, that sort of thing, but we can actually get them implemented and in place. That's where we want organizations to start measuring progress. And what they will find is just doing some of these things that are high risk, low level of effort can serve as compensating controls. It can buy them time as they kind of slowly move from left to right across this chart, right? So you want to plan it out. You want to be showing progress, because if you try to start all the way from that most high risk to the one that will take you the most time, the team will get frustrated because they feel like they're not making progress. Leadership will start to get frustrated. So we actually, we want to, start building the staircase as we move along. So that's how we help prioritize, implementation strategies based upon all the recommendations that come out when we're working with clients. So really, this kind of sums it up. We want to plan the strategy, but it is very important to be honest with yourself, identify what those gaps are. So, you can actually make that decision. Can I fix that gap with the technologies we have today, just reinvest in what we already have? Or is this something where we need to justify the elevated spend for technology, process, or actually people to help with this? And really, the testing, the implementation, the validation is probably one of the most important pieces. I think many CISOs that I work with after a ransomware event, they always, one of the things they say was, we always thought, our architecture was architected or secured in a certain way, but we never actually tested to validate, the realistic truth of how things were present within the environment. And so that's always their key takeaway is if they could go back in time, they would have done testing and that validation to identify those gaps and try to get ahead of something before an adversary does. So that's all I had today. So I appreciate everyone sticking around for the end of the MWise conference. And if anyone has any questions, I think we might have a few minutes or I can stick around.
Yeah, we have a good 5 minutes. But first and foremost, let's thank Matthew. Round of applause, please. That was a great presentation. Thank you so, so much. Okay, we'll open it up to questions. If you want to raise your hand, I'll come on over with the mic.
So who owns backup and recovery? Because that, at least in my experience, has always been a hot potato between IT and security. So what are you seeing and where is it most effective?
Yeah, so we do see where IT owns it. But when security has a part in some of the architecture and the hardening and the best practice, that's a perfect balance, right? That's where we want to be because we want to make sure security really understands just the ease of access or what guardrails exist to actually protect it. But yeah, commonly security is not going to own the backup infrastructure, but they should have influence into the architecture and from the identity and from the network exposure perspective, most certainly.
Okay, we have another question back here.
Thank you. About 3 or 4 slides ago, you had a 3-2-1 strategy. What was that?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, so that's 3 copies of your backups where you want 2 offline or offsite and 1 just totally offline and 3 different types of media. Yeah.
Next question. Come on. All right.
Question about Duo. You mentioned, the graph of getting stronger. 2-part question. So, do you see a difference between the push option versus, sending codes? And then the second question is to reach that higher level. Does that require a token, hard token?
Yeah, so to answer your first question, just the push without the code, we see from MFA fatigue where adversaries will just start spamming people and they will eventually either just say yes just to make the messages go away, or sometimes they might be confused. Like they might feel like, well, I just authenticated, I got this 10 minutes later, maybe it's just delayed and they'll click yes. So I think the code actually provides the human the ability to actually maybe contextualize a little more and think about why am I entering this? But it is still subject to social engineering. We have seen many times when attackers will call and say, I'm the help desk, read me the code, I'm trying to help you. So just want to ensure it's definitely not foolproof, but if I had to rate one over the other, I would say the code over just the blind push. It's a little more thought and it's a little more effort as to, okay, well, why am I putting this in? Because I actually just put this in 5 minutes ago or something like that. So then to your other question about, going up to the upper right quadrant, it doesn't have to be hardware like Windows Hello. If you have the TPM module in your device, I mean, it really, passwordless is public-private key, integration now. So it doesn't have to be, totally like a separate, something that you plug into USB and you have to do the biometric. It really just depends on the hardware that you have. But I think the most important part of that is even if you can't do the FIDO2, if you're doing the strong auth, but you're requiring the device to be compliant based upon attributes of that device, or trusted because maybe it needs to be Azure AD joins, for example, for hybrid join, that part of the transaction where you're bringing the device and the person together is super, super strong, and that actually can go a long way. Even organizations that might not quite be at FIDO2, but they bring that device into the transaction, that's a lot harder to defeat than when it's just the singular nature of the identity doing that transaction.
Okay, right over here.
So in one of the slides, you mentioned for your DCs, don't have them all virtualized. What about those of us that are 100% cloud?
Yeah, cloud's a little bit different. I would say for cloud, depends on what cloud provider you're in. You want to understand the roles that you have that can actually, interface with your compute and your VMs in the cloud, right? Because we have seen organizations where roles maybe have the ability to actually run commands on those VMs in the cloud, then they can take them down that way. There's a little bit of a different attack path, but it really requires understanding your roles and permissions. But when it's like on-prem, when it's the bare metal, and they're all there, then yeah, that's a different story, because then they get all taken down. So I would say if you're purely in the cloud, not a bad thing. You just want to understand your roles and who those identities that have the power to interface with your compute, right? That you have strong authentication and separation of those identities and a lot of monitoring around those for the cloud. Yep.
Okay, we have time for one more question. I see a hand raised right here.
So do you have a statistic on help desks? Which help desk types are more susceptible to social engineering? And I'm referring to outsourced help desks versus insourced.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't have a statistic for that. I'll sync up with you afterwards. I might be able to dig one up. I don't have one off the top of my head, but it's a great question.